question, but depends on the call.
Yeah.
Did a ring by this morning.
Okay, shall I make a start then? Okay, well, thank you for those of you that have taken some time out to come and join the presentation this afternoon. I was standing in, there was due to be a seminar in Bath as part of World Water Week, and obviously that hasn't happened, so I offered to talk about some of the work that I've done previously. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm just fiddling with the screen here to take away some of the distractions. And so I'm just going to bring this up so I can see who's on here. So I can see. Right, okay. So yeah, just to give it a little bit of background, I previously worked for National Rivers Authority years ago, showing my age, Environment Agency, Natural Resources Wales, and then before I joined Cardiff University, I worked on the Swansea Bay Tidal Lagoon project as the head of fisheries there, which is quite exciting, being involved in a sort of multi-billion-pound scheme, which unfortunately has never got any further. So yeah, I'll explain sort of some of the work that I've done on that programme. Before I do so, I don't know, for those who haven't used Zoom before, on the bottom of your screen, if you take your mouse and hover it around the middle of the screen, you should come up with a set of options, including sort of, there should be one called participants. If you go click on that, you've then got an option of a raised hand symbol. So I don't know if you can find that and just click on it to show that you've found it. Excellent, lots of raised hand. So what I can see on my, so I've got a list of all the participants and can see who's online, and I get a raised hand appearing against your name. So as I'm giving the presentation, you have a burning question about something I talk about, then click on there and I'll try and keep an eye on the screen at the same time as talking, and I can unmute you then and let you ask the question, okay? All right, let's make a start then. Okay, so yeah, so I'll give you a little bit of background. I'm talking to you about tidal lagoons. I'll run through tidal range energy. Hopefully, most of you will be familiar with it and the benefits, some of the history, whether you'll be aware of the sites across the world that exist. So there's a bit of history, bit of geography, bit of biology, bit of engineering, bit of maths, bit of everything involved in this, because I wasn't quite sure, you know, the extent of the audience that would be joining in. I'll then talk specifically about the Swansea Lagoon project, what that was going to entail or might still do. It's not quite dead in the water yet. Some of the construction aspects of that, how the lagoon would operate, and then I will move on to what was sort of my area, which was working on the environmental impacts, and in particular on fish, and explain a little bit about the modelling work that we did to try and come up with a way of assessing potential impacts of the lagoon. Okay, I've got a. Does somebody, is it? I'm just. This sounds very formal. Who's Barnes J1?
Yeah, that's me.
Hey, did you have a question?
No, I don't. I'm not quite sure.
Because your hand's raised. So that's
oh, sorry.
No, that's all right.
I'll unraise it.
Just shows the system works. That was a good test. Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, thanks. Okay, so obviously, why lagoons? Well, and I guess it's appropriate to talk about on a day like when we talk about it's World Water Day, and the theme this year is climate change. Obviously, you'll be familiar. You know, the fact that 1986, the extent of sea ice was this large. You know, and it's gradually shrinking year on year, and it's even smaller now. And that coincides with climate change. We've got global warming taking place. and all the different weather extremes that that entails. And so clearly there's been a move to sort of try and climate change issues, and this is where sort of tidal energy has been sort of brought into that mix to try and mitigate some of the impacts of sort of fossil fuels. Briefly, if we look at the exports of energy, so this basically shows the areas of dark green are where the UK was a net importer of energy, and the lighter green where we were actually a net exporter. So you can see between 1980 and 2004-ish, for most of those years, we were actually exporting energy in terms of fuel, and in this case it was oil, apart from the bit in the middle around 1992, and that was when the Piper Alpha accident occurred, which obviously dented our ability to export energy at that particular time. But as you can see, you know, we're basically, a lot of our energy is still brought into the country from overseas. And this involves one example down here near where I live, Aberthorpe Power Station in South Wales, which is due to close, but that was burning until recently 6,000 to 8,000 tons of Russian coal. And I think that was a day. It was a staggering amount. And of course, it had been brought in from elsewhere, which in light of current events, you know, means it could become vulnerable, that source of energy as well. So the more we can generate our own sources of energy, I think the more secure we would become in the future. Obviously, renewables are growing all the time. You know, on a day like today, solar power will be probably working flat out. Not so much, we've got a bit of a breeze down here in South Wales, but the wind farms might not be generating quite as much as they normally would. And the other sort of forms of renewable are being brought into that mix. So we've got biomass and we've got hydropower plants. And by hydro, that is referring to sort of run-of-river hydro schemes. And obviously what we're looking to do is replace the sort of the coal-fired power stations have been phased out, and obviously gas-fired power stations, and you know, they still produce most of our energy by source. But we are looking obviously to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels. So obviously one area in which we can do that is to look at sort of marine renewable energy generation. And again, I don't want to teach brownies just as kegs, but I don't know who you know, what backgrounds you've each got. So you know, forgive me if I sort of I'm stating the obvious here. But obviously there's wave energy is one type. That's still pretty much in its infancy because it's a difficult means of gathering the energy, and you need a lot of sort of infrastructure in order to do that. We've got tidal stream, which is basically the equivalent of underwater wind turbines. And there are certain locations around the coast where you get high tidal current velocities and where tidal stream might be feasible. One of the difficulties there is the stability of structures and the particularly harsh environment in which you come to operate, particularly underwater. Offshore wind is obviously massive and growing. A lot of the areas around the UK where offshore wind turbines can be placed in sort of the shallower areas have been developed, and obviously people are now looking further offshore, so they're looking at sort of potential floating offshore wind farms. And then what I specifically wanted to talk about today is around tidal range. So this is where it's using the head of the wave, so we've got a large difference between high and low water, and using that potential energy in that to drive turbines. And I will come on to the detail of that in a moment. But if we look around the world, you know, where is the potential for tidal range? So you look where are the biggest tides. The largest tides in the world occur in the Bay of Fundy, which is here, in sort of eastern seaboard of Canada, followed in second place by ourselves here in Bristol Channel in the UK, where we've got the second highest range here. And then there are certain other locations dotted around the world where they've got high tidal ranges and the right sort of bathymetry that may be suitable for construction, but not in every case. And I'll mention that again in a moment. Okay, so a couple of examples from I don't know if people are familiar with the Laurence in France, the Laurence River, situated sort of northern coast of France near St. Malo, which is just at the entrance of what was the estuary. Basically this, so you can see in here, this was built, and it is a barrage rather than a lagoon, but just one of the nearest things that we've got. Built approximately 50 years ago. It's got, I think it's 20 turbines, and it's got sluices built into it as well. So this is the actual sluices operating here, and the turbine, so they let water into the Rance estuary, and then it generates on the outgoing tide. So the turbines are in this area here, on just to the right of the picture. Got a lot of criticism for sort of the environmental damage that was caused when this was constructed back in the 1950s. Or 1960s rather, so it's been operating for over 50 years now. But that's perhaps not surprising when you consider how it was constructed. And the method that they used was to put two cofferdams right the way across the estuary. And in effect, whilst they were constructing the barrage over a number of years, they turned what was an estuarine situation into pretty much a freshwater lake upstream of the cofferdams. So you've got the marine on the seaward side, and then it became freshwater on the landward side. And then when they'd finished construction, they let the marine water back into that freshwater lake. So it had gone from being an estuarine, saline situation to freshwater, and then back to something like an estuarine situation again. But obviously that would have decimated any ecology within that area at the time. And even back in the 1990s, it wasn't back to normal, hadn't fully recovered, but it was at least heading that way. There were studies that compared the Rance estuary, which had been affected by the barrage, to neighbouring estuaries which hadn't, to demonstrate that the ecologies were reaching sort of a similar status in the two. Another site, perhaps on a slightly smaller scale, is in Annapolis Royale. So this is the Bay of Fundy, and if you recall, this is where the highest tidal ranges occur. So this is on the eastern seaboard of Canada. And at this site, oh, I've overlaid the pictures I wanted, never mind, right, okay. But here, basically, there was this causeway that was built, or a barrage that was built across the mouth of the Annapolis River. It was built, I think, two purposes. One, to provide a transport route from one side of that. If you go back, oh, sorry, hold on. What have I done here? No. You go back here. So it's situated in this long, narrow tidal inlet here. And so what they wanted to do is provide some sort of transport link across that inlet, but also they built the barrage with a view to keeping the high tides out of the upper end of that inlet so that they could reclaim the salt marsh land adjacent to what was previously the estuary of the Annapolis River. So it's a land reclamation scheme back in the 1960s, pretty much this one. And what they included at the time were the sluices, which you can see just in the sort of the foreground of the picture. And it was only back at, so the point there is that the damage was probably done to the ecology upstream with the loss of salt marshes and so on back in the 1960s when this was built. And it was only in the 1980s that they then decided to add a single tidal turbine, which is in the middle of your screen. Okay, so, you know, this is where when people talk about the impacts of in this case, the tidal turbines, have a little bit careful about what impact that had on the overall ecology of the area, because that damage, some of that damage would have been done previously. I'm not saying that this turbine didn't cause any damage. It was constructed, but there was an awful lot of damage, I think, done beforehand. Okay, and then the closest we've got to what was being proposed in Swansea can be found in Siwa in South Korea. And here you can see this is Siwa Bay. And they built a causeway across the bay. So this is several kilometers long, this causeway, basically to get the high tides out of this area, out of Siwa Bay, with a view to then being able to reclaim the land, the low-lying land around the coast. And they've since developed that low-lying land, basically it's become urban areas, towns and cities, as well as industrial areas. And once they built this, they suddenly realized that actually they created this massive lake into which all these urban areas were draining, and they'd created a huge sort of water quality issue. So they then had to think, how do they solve that water quality issue? And their solution was to actually build a tidal power plant that would serve two purposes. One, it would generate electricity, but it would also act as a sluicing mechanism. So there'd be an exchange of water between the lake in Shewa and the open sea on the outside. And that would occur on every tide then. So that was their mechanism for improving the water quality. As you can see on this diagram, this has actually got this, it's actually a two-tier dual carriageway running across that barrage. So you can see the two lanes of traffic here on the top. But actually, my understanding is actually another lower level of traffic as well. Whether that runs in the other direction, I'm not actually sure, but it's, you know, it serves, again, several purposes. So back in the UK, so that's a bit of a global picture. You know, where are the suitable sites here? Well, we've obviously got the Bristol Channel, and these areas circled are the areas that the company I worked for got their eye on in terms of potential for tidal lagoon development. So you've got those around the Bristol Channel. You've got North Wales and Colwyn Bay, and then there's an area off the coast of Cumbria, which I don't know if you're aware of that, Ari. So yeah, so these are the areas, and basically these are the areas where we've got the sort of the highest tidal ranges and the suitable coastline, if you like, in terms of the bathymetry, the depth that you've got in those areas. And they're also looking as well around Brittany and Normandy in northern France. The reason for obviously looking particularly down here in the Bristol Channel, these are photographs of Porthcawl, which is just around the corner where I actually live. But you can see here on the left-hand picture, the huge tidal range that you experience here. You know, there's a person stood on the beach on the left, and there's a person up here by the lighthouse. And you just see that massive difference that you get, sort of, you know, it's 10 to 12 meters in tidal range. And then the picture on the right is obviously with the tide in again at that same location. So absolutely massive, huge volumes of water flowing in and out. So people have been thinking for many years, you know, how can they possibly harness the power of the Bristol Channel and the Severn Estuary? The Victorians had ideas about how they might do it. So this was a proposed barrage rather than a lagoon across the estuary. I think it's from Breen down across towards Penarth, near Cardiff. There have been various studies undertaken by the past governments looking at what the options might be. So the Bond 1981 committee looked at a whole range of different options. This was followed up in, well, it reported, I think in 2013, there was another government committee looking at Severn tidal power, considering, you know, what there would be the sort of construction cost, the environmental impacts, the economic impacts, and the uncertainties associated with the construction of the barrages. And at the time, they sort of reported that they didn't believe that they were a viable proposition. That was the barrages, and that perhaps lagoons and other less impactful solutions should be considered, and more focus on renewables as well. So it was as a result of those sort of discussions and this idea, perhaps we should look at other alternatives to barrages across the whole estuary, that the Swansea Bay Tidal Lagoon concept was born. So this is a you know, artist's impression of the lagoon wall. Again, I'll touch on this in a minute, but as you can see, the idea was that it'd be, not only would it serve as sort of an energy generating scheme, it would actually be an attraction, it'd be a tourist attraction, lots of recreational activity, lots of commercial activity operating on and around the lagoon. So to give you sort of more of a flavour of those sort of activities and where it's located, just to point out some landmarks on the map here, you've got the Swansea Bay University campus, for those who aren't maybe familiar with it, situated here. So this is one of the main routes into Swansea, Fabian Way. And you've got then the city centre over here on the left-hand side. The River Towie comes into Swansea Bay at this point here, and there's a navigation channel along this side of the lagoon, the proposed lagoon. And then the River Neath, and the River Neath channel comes in on the right-hand side as you look at that diagram. But as you can see, the whole range of different activities. They were talking about having swimming, sailing. There'd be some sort of fish farming taking place within the lagoon, potentially fin fish farming, so, you know, as opposed to shellfish farming. Okay, there was talk on the based on the land of having hatcheries. So one of the impacts of the lagoon would be on the what was left of the, if there are any left, native oyster population within the bay. So one of the requirements would be to rescue any of those native oysters and relocate them. And we would think, okay, as a company, could we take those native oysters and actually rear native oysters and reinstate them in an area where they've been lost because of overexploitation in the past? So that was another thought. And then there's all the, say, the facilities. So there'd be a visitor centre, and then you've got the hatchery, and you've got the recreational storage centres and so on as well. So again, I actually only found this picture. I'd never, having worked there for 3 years, never actually seen it. It's sort of, it's an artist's impression of what it would look like from the shore, looking out. And this, so the power generating station is situated 2.5 kilometres out to sea. And you've got this massive 9.5 kilometre wall that would run around, basically creating and encompassing this area here. A few things to point out there. Yes, we've got this is where the River Towie comes in. So you've got Swansea docks. They exit here, so they don't actually exit into the lagoon. And this is the Neath shipping channel here. You can just see in the estuary. So again, that doesn't go. So there's no rivers entering the lagoon itself, even though you've got the River Towie. And one of the sort of misconceptions was that you know this area would be lost from sort of
Hi, Andy. We can't hear you. You have to mute your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's great now. I can hear you.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah. For some reason, I lost details. So let me see what I can get right. I can see everybody. I'm just going to fiddle with my view that I have. There we go. And I'll try and share the screen again now. Sorry about that. Okay. Oh dear. Sorry, this is going a bit pear-shaped. Bear with me a minute, folks. What's happening here? Sorry, I managed to upload the wrong presentation. Just get rid of that. Right, try and share it again. Okay, can people see that again now?
Yeah, it's all fine now.
Okay, good. But that's fine. I will try and. Are you seeing a full screen there now, or just a?
Yeah, I can see the full screen now. It's different from previous
Okay.
one. That's good.
Okay, right. Okay, so right. Okay, great. Yeah, so this is just an idea of the construction of the bund wall. And I guess the important thing here is there's an awful lot of material that goes actually below the low water mark. And I mentioned it earlier about how important the bathymetry is and whether lagoons are actually viable. They did look in the Bay of Fundy, where you've got the highest tidal range, and you'd think, oh, that would be the ideal place to put a lagoon. But the difficulty you've got there is the bathymetry is such that it's a lot deeper, closer to the shore. And so the volume of material that you require under the water to encompass the same volume of water in terms of using that for energy generation becomes disproportionately large. And so the economics of it and the actual engineering ability becomes more inviable at the moment anyway, not as practicable. Okay. In terms of the construction, this would obviously be determined in collaboration with the contractors that would be appointed to build the scheme. But what they were looking at here was you'd create a massive bunded area where the turbine housing would be located. And they were looking at sort of precast construction. So it almost like building using Lego blocks to build the housing and sluice structures, and then shipping them out on barges and lowering and lowering them into the right sort of location. And in terms of the sort of the turbine design, these have changed over the years. Obviously, they've become more efficient in terms of their energy generation, but also more efficient in terms of their impacts on wildlife and fish in particular as well. So the image on the top right is of the turbine, a typical turbine has got a Laurent, but they've got 4 blades on the turbine, so you can see there's very little gap between the turbine. And these are about 5.5 meters in diameter, whereas the ones in Korea, which is the lower picture, they're 7.6 meters in diameter, and have got a much bigger gap between the blades, which there's much greater opportunity for fish and other creatures to pass through without being struck by the blades. And this is again just to give an illustration of the scale of what we're talking about. These are sort of the component parts of the turbines, and you can just see by the sort of the size of each turbine, when you total this up, weighs approximately 1,000 tons. So there's an awful lot of materials going into these, and obviously, as a local company, we were hoping that a lot of the materials and the raw materials and the construction work would actually take place locally, because those aren't familiar. So Southwest and Swansea area in particular has got a lot of deprived communities there. So this was seen as being a sort of massive boost to the local economy if it were to go ahead. And I guess in future it might become more and more important as well, given the current scheme of things. So in terms of the construction schedule, I'll just briefly, this is just to give you an indication. We are talking about several years to construct the lagoon. And again, it would depend on the contractor that's doing the job and sort of resources they were able to throw at it and their working methods, just how long it would take. Obviously, from a company's point of view, they wanted to get it up and running as soon as possible, because obviously that means they're generating more quickly. Move on then to sort of the environmental impact. Obviously, any scheme like this has got potentially huge impacts, and it's got impacts during the construction phases, particularly during the operational phase. So the construction phase might last that sort of 4 to 5 years. The operational phase, the plan there was it would be for 120 years once it's built. And then if at any point we had to decommission it either at the 120-year mark or before that, then obviously we had to consider, well, what the impacts of decommissioning on local wildlife and the wider environment. So it considered a whole range of different factors. I'm going to pick on a couple here just to illustrate the sort of things that were looked at before the lagoon sort of started going through the planning processes. So obviously they had to look at the substrate conditions in Swansea Bay. That's obviously vitally important in terms of, from the engineer's point of view, what can be built where, but also from what's the impact of the lagoon on shifting silts. Is the lagoon itself going to silt up? Is it going to impact on the shipping lanes either side of the lagoon? This consideration. Also needed to look at water quality conditions. So again, another example. So the baseline is that top left-hand diagram. You can see the red areas, these are the sort of the E. coli concentrations. And the reason why you've got this high concentration of bacteria in that area is because the main Swansea sewage treatment works actually discharges through an outfall. It's treated effluent, and it discharges in the middle of where that red area is. Okay, and if you remember, this is pretty much where the lagoon was going to be constructed. So the lagoon without any mitigation, which is the image to the right, so you can see the outline of the lagoon, and this is assuming that the seawall, this outfall, the sewage outfall rather, still discharged into the lagoon. So we'd end up with a lagoon full of potentially contaminated water if no mitigation was applied. So to store the storm water that's generated in Swansea, so you don't get these flushes of bacteria into the bay. But that was it's pretty much impractical just because of the volume of water that would need to be stored. So the other option, which is your bottom left diagram, is actually moving that outfall to beyond the confines of the lagoon. So moving it out further out into the Bristol Channel. And that has advantages in it. It starts to clean up more. Yeah, so that's one. And then another one is in terms of the water treatment, is applying ultraviolet disinfection to the storm water that comes from the water treatment works, or sewage works rather. But again, looking at the viability and the costs associated with that, I think the preferred option was moving the outfall further out to sea. Moving on to sort of consider the impacts on things like dolphins, seals, porpoises in the area. So there's a lot of surveys that were undertaken to see where these occurred. And you can see by the dots, this is where they were identified using aerial surveys, reconnaissance surveys. And then moving on to find out actually what species were located within Swansea Bay and the area around it, what times of the year were they there, what life stages of fish were present, and you know, in particular the type of species that would be expected. And that's where sort of my role came in, is saying, okay, so we know the species of fish that are present in the bay, what's the impact on them? And the Swansea Bay itself isn't a renowned sort of commercial fishing area, but what is important is it's a renowned area for fish passing through it. So it's on the migration routes of lots of fish. We've got what I call sort of non-biologists. So there's diadromous fish species. These are fish that pass from freshwater into the marine environment and vice versa in order to complete their life cycles. And of those, there's one catadromous fish species, which is the freshwater or European eel. I should say it's not freshwater eel, European eel, and that migrates out from rivers, goes across the Atlantic, spawns in the Caribbean, and then they migrate as juvenile. The adults then die, but the juveniles, the eggs and the larvae of those eels, then drift back across the Atlantic from the Caribbean across to Europe and re-enter our rivers. And it takes them sort of 2 to 3 years to do that. The anadromous species are the ones that migrate into freshwater, so into our rivers to spawn. So I'll come on to that in a minute, but salmon, sea trout, river lamprey, sea lamprey, and tway shad, all of which are protected. So we have to pay particular attention to potential impacts on those. So what we started to look at, and this is when I joined the company, they were looking at the sort of the impacts of the turbines by looking at, well, what was the encounter rate of the fish with the actual lagoon? So this is the probability, if you like, of a fish swimming in the Bristol Channel encountering the turbines. And if they do encounter the turbines, what's the subsequent risk of injury of fish passing through them? Because not all fish will be injured. And I'll come on and explain that a little bit in a moment. So two mechanisms were being looked at to produce a turbine impact. So in 2015, they modelled it and came up with values. They then consulted on it, and Environment Agency and NRW and the local angling fraternity were very unhappy with some of the methods that we used. The original method was this diagram. This is a still from sort of like a video that's been produced, a video and model, and it's an individual-based model. So each of these little black dots is an individually parameterized fish, and in this case, it's juvenile eels. So this is elvers, or the baby eels as they're approaching our shores. And the model would then run the tidal cycles, and these fish would scan for, and we would see how many are modelled entering the lagoon. So from that, you could then calculate, well, this is the probability of elvers entering the lagoon. So we've got our sort of encounter probability based on these individual-based models. And then you'd multiply that against the injury from the turbines. But I say the angling fraternity and the regulators weren't happy with elements of this individual-based models because they felt some really key parameters, fish behaviours, hadn't been included in the models. Okay? So that was the point that I joined the company and started to think, well, what else could we do which would meet their requirements as well? So we stuck with the injury aspects of the model. So this was if the fish did encounter, what was the impact? And this looked at 4 basic mechanisms by which fish could be injured. They could be directly injured by the blades turning or swinging into the blades. So that's the blade strike. There are various shear stresses that would occur here. And this is, for those that aren't aware, is when you get 2 bodies of water, in this case, moving rapidly alongside one another and creating like a scissor action. And that can cause severe damage to fish. Factors, so you can take the scales off a fish, which if the scales are removed, that's their protective coating, if you like, which leaves them then prone to secondary infections. There are pressure changes as water moves from an area of depth to a shallower area. And then you get cavitation, which is the best way to describe this. Everybody's seen an outboard motor running on a small boat, it creates lots of air bubbles. Well, those air bubbles are created underwater, and they basically implode, which is like an explosion, and that can actually cause damage to any fish that are in the vicinity. I didn't realize, but the cavitation is actually very damaging from an engineering point of view to the structure of the turbines as well, and can actually cause pitting and damage to the turbine blades and other infrastructure. So clearly, from an engineering point of view, is something that needs to be avoided. But this model, this striker model, basically took all these factors into consideration and worked out for a given size of and species of fish what the likely impacts would be. What it didn't do was directly consider what's the impact on predation of fish, or if they're injured, what happens to them if they don't actually get killed. And so we've sort of included that within the modelling, the sort of post-injury infection, and assumed that if a fish even gets a slight glance off a turbine, then it's actually considered to have died. So throughout the whole process, we sort of looked at the impact of the turbines. You can see this little table on the side. We started off originally, the design was based on a 4-blade fixed speed, 67 revolutions per minute turbine, and similar to those used elsewhere. But it basically showed this produced some significant shear stresses, and these shear stresses caused quite significant impacts on some of the fish species, which hopefully on the next slide you'll see. So the green bars here, and these figures, ignore the figures, they've now changed subsequently, but basically the green bars are the impacts that were predicted on the fish with the old fixed speed turbine. They then changed to this Andritz variable speed turbine. So the speed would vary, I think it's between 28 RPM and 94 RPM. But in being able to vary the speed, you were able to control the flows of water better through the turbines and create more laminar flows, which basically it reduced the impact of shear stresses in pressure and cavitation, which then had a massive impact on, particularly if you look at shad and herring, in terms of the impacts on those fish species. And the more laminar the flows are through the turbines, the better as well from an energy generation. You can predict with more confidence what energy you will generate on each tidal cycle then. So it served two good purposes. It was good for energy generation engineers, and it was good for the fish as well. Sorry, I should say, and the way they achieved that, they moved from fixed speed to a variable speed, and they also moved from a 4-blade turbine to a 3-blade turbine as well, which made a big difference. So I mentioned, I won't go into too much detail, I mentioned about the IBM model, and this was the original way of calculating the encounter risk. We came up with a mechanism that we called the draw zone approach, and I'll explain a little bit about how that would work. But first, I'm going to talk about sort of try and put that into context and how it impacts on the draw zone calculations that we used, is to consider, well, what's the typical life cycle of one of those migratory fish species? And if you take Atlantic salmon, hopefully this will work. So you have adult Atlantic salmon. They live for much of their sort of, they're growing into adult fish up in the North Atlantic. So they'll go up to the Faroe Islands, to Greenland, that sort of area where there's rich feeding ground. So that's where they'll grow. And they will return after 1 or 2 years or more at sea into fresh water. So they've made that transition. They've moved from the marine environment into the freshwater environment. They do that so they can, this is actually a picture of some gravels in the bottom of a river. And that's where they actually lay their eggs. So they lay their eggs in the autumn in this area. Once they've laid their eggs, they've got two choices. A small proportion survive as kelps and return back to sea. But much larger proportion, sadly, they basically just die after spawning. Okay. The eggs that are in the gravels, they will hatch in the spring. So around this time of year or slightly earlier. They then grow on to become fry and then become par, which is camouflaged fish here. So you can see this, it's sort of got these markings, which basically makes it highly camouflaged against the gravel background in a typical sort of stream that we find in Northern Europe. After sort of 2 or 3 years in fresh water, these parr decide that they're going to migrate back out to sea. And they do so, and they change, and they become very silvery. So they adapt. If they retained their camouflage in the river and the sea, they'd be camouflaged anymore. So they become silver with adaptation to camouflage them at sea. It's a survival tactic there, where they then migrate to the North Atlantic and completely cycle. Now, this is really important because it means that these fish are passing as smolts, as potentially 2-year classes of adults, and potentially as kelps, past the location of the lagoon. And so we have to consider in our models the life stages that the lagoon is likely to have an impact on. So in this case, for salmon, we consider 4 life stages in all of our models. And that is a factor that wasn't included in the earlier modeling. And in doing that, we then have to consider a whole range of different parameters. So these are the behaviors of the fish that they might encounter, and the biological characteristics of those fish as well. One of the, again, that the anglers and the regulators, the Environment Agency and NOW were concerned about was that originally the fish in the IBM model were models moving fairly rapidly from the marine environment into the fresh water, perhaps in one tide, and therefore bypassing the lagoon with minimal delay. The reality, though, which I tend to agree with, is that these fish are likely to mill around, and these could be 2 different species of fish. In doing so, they'll be spending longer in this area and therefore more susceptible to encountering the turbines and being lost. So the impacts are likely to be greater than the original modelling was suggesting. And you've got fish going into the River Tower, you've got fish also going into the River Neath and the River Avon over here as well. So the original models only focused on 1 river, when in fact there are actually 3 rivers that could potentially be impacted in Swansea Bay as well. And you've also, such as the in 4 rivers in the United Kingdom, 1 in the River Towie, which is to the west of Swansea, and then 3 rivers, the Usk, the Wye and the Severn, which are further up the Bristol Channel. So these shad, the theory at the time was that they might be passing Swansea Bay on their migration, both upstream to go and spawn and then on their return. And it's only in recent weeks that we've actually got confirmation that some of these fish do enter Swansea Bay, but not in the numbers that perhaps we were originally considering and for the length of time. So duration of presence, how long the fish spend in the bay, is quite an important factor for some of these species that we needed to consider in the models. Their presence, are they there all year round? So you don't really need to look at the figures, but it's just to show that, so with salmon, for example, we know, because there's been trapping taking place on the River Towie, that when the local populations are moving through Swansea Bay in their highest numbers, so in this case, it's in June, July time. So we're able to factor that into the models. We were able to look at the swimming speeds of the fish. So again, you can see we've got the 4 life stages. We know the approximate, well, the model would select a random length for the fish between different an upper and lower parameter. And from that, we would apply a swimming speed, again, between upper and lower parameters to work out for each individual time the model is run, you'd be a particular length of each of these fish and a different swimming speed for them as well. And then that swimming speed is a key factor in other elements of the model. But one of the areas here, fish have got various swimming speeds. They've got almost like a set of gears that they can go through. And I found this diagram this morning that actually sums it up. So if you look at the bottom line here, pretty much the fastest the fish can go is their burst swimming speed. And they can only do this for a few seconds, maintain that for a few seconds, but they can move incredibly rapidly, might be 5 or 6 body lengths per second. They can burst away from, and they've used that perhaps for escaping from a predator. They've then got their sort of, if I pick another one, the maximum sustained swimming speed, which is how fast they can swim for, I think it's 200 minutes is the period that's generally used for scientific purposes. And then there's the optimum cruising speed, which is basically it's almost like not quite their slowest swimming speed, but it's towards the bottom end of their swimming speed. So a salmon returning from the North Atlantic will probably maintain its cruising swimming speed as it returns. And this is the swimming speed we've used in the model in order to take a precautionary approach. So we don't, if we use the burst swimming speed, we would probably underestimate the impacts that the lagoon would have on the salmon. That was swimming speeds. We used some of the biological characteristics. So we looked at the age structure of the fish and whether they're these one-sea winter fish that would be, say about 2 feet long, or would they be a multi-sea winter fish, which is potentially a much bigger fish then as well. And that's important because that then has an impact on the egg production capacity of those fish. So a smaller female will produce a smaller number of eggs. And obviously then we need to look at sort of the sex ratios of the fish, which isn't 50-50, as you can see. It does vary. And in multi-sea winter fish, for example, you get a greater proportion of females amongst that population. We also need to consider sort of the population range that the fish inhabit. So in the case of a salmon, once they've gone up to the North Atlantic, they're out of harm's way and can't be impacted by the lagoon. But sea trout, on the other hand, live more locally to Swansea Bay. And so we looked at various options for the population range, and the figure on the left shows the area that we've actually used. So this is the area that the fish can swim around in, and whilst they're swimming in that area, be at risk of encountering the lagoon. We could have gone, and we were trying to push to go for a much larger area, because some of the science suggests that sea trout do actually migrate around the whole coast of Ireland and up into Scotland from South Wales rivers. I'll try and explain this as, basically the concept of the draw zone model was that in front of the turbines on each tidal cycle, you get an area of fast flowing water. And we were suggesting that if fish swimming at their cruising speed were to enter that area of fast flowing water, then they would be drawn through the turbines. So what we want to try and do is calculate how many fish would actually enter this draw zone area. And we need to do that by looking at, well, how far could they travel on one tidal cycle within their population range? And so it looked at the probability of them encountering this area in front of the turbines and factoring that into the model. So that was the draw zone. There's probably a whole new presentation around that aspect of the model alone, so I won't go into more detail about it now, but could do if people wanted me to at some point in the future. And obviously we have to consider here as well, another point in each of these life stages, we have to consider the impact on the flood as the fish are going into the lagoon, but we also have to consider the impacts of fish exiting the lagoon as well. So there's sort of double impact there potentially. So those parameters that I talked about, and there are numerous other parameters as well, including one that we actually managed to build in, which is called avoidance. So with the encounter model, it assumes that the fish there aren't any sort of behavioural traits in the fish that make them basically like steer away and avoid the area of the turbine. So I believe they would do that because they're, fish are highly sensory creatures, and I think they'll pick up on the structures, they'll pick up on the noise from the turbines, they'll pick up on the accelerating flows and potentially take then avoiding action. But we don't know to what degree that would take place. So all these factors then built into our model, and it started out as a deterministic model coming out with a single value. We then moved to this Monte Carlo predicting model. So for each of the parameters, we've set an upper and lower limit, and we've agreed these with the regulators, so they're happy with those. And we've then, the model then, on each iteration of the model, will pick for each parameter between those upper and lower limits. And we run that, and we run it for 100,000 times for each species and life stage in order to get the impact assessment. So this is just an example of the output that we get. This is the probability distribution of impacts. And the regulators, in our case, of Tidal Lagoon, have said for salmon, sea trout, lamprey and shad, they want us to use the 99th percentile impact value, which is here. And you can see on it, so the vast majority of occurrences the impact is going to be far, far lower. It's down around a mean of 1%, or the median or modal figure is about 0.5%, which is actually the most likely occurrence. But we're having to assess the impacts at the 10%, around the 10% level, in this case for salmon. And from when I was working for Tidal Lagoon, obviously we were sort of saying, well, you know, this is a bit unfair that you're using this sort of high level impact, because we've been precautionary in respect of the model. You know, we've used those upper and lower values that create sort of the biggest impacts all the way through. And now we're being asked, having done that modelling, to take again the more extreme values. But I guess from a regulator's point of view, nobody's built a lagoon yet, so nobody's certain what these impacts are going to be. So they have to be highly precautionary in this instance. What would have been great would be if we could go to somewhere like Lawrence or Shewa and actually do some fish impact assessments there. But unfortunately, we haven't had that luxury of being able to do it, because EDF Energy and the energy company in Korea were reluctant to let anybody go near their sites. I guess because they're active energy generation sites would be one reason why that is the case. Having used the models and run them, we then were asked to run sensitivity analysis, and this was quite a laborious task. So I mentioned there were lots of different other parameters. You can see these hopefully on your screen. So we've got the striker, which is the injury model. We've got the duration of presence, which I talked about. I talked about avoidance. There's different aspects of that: population range, sex ratio, and so on. So a range of for some species is actually whether the fish are nocturnal or not. So we consider that within them. Fishes like lamprey and eel tend to be active at night rather than during the daytime, and so factored that in as well. So this sort of illustrates the number of parameters that we had to consider. And if you look along the axis at the bottom there, you can see actually the number of species and life stages that we considered as well. So for sea trout, we actually ended up having to consider, I think it was 17 different life stages, so 17 different runs, if you like. So 24 hours to run the sea trout model generally when we set that off. So we've done basically millions of model runs to get to a position to identify which parameters the lagoon would be impacted or the fish would be most sensitive to. So having come up with sort of the impacts, we need to consider sort of what monitoring we might need to do to prove for them, gain empirical evidence to show what those impacts are. And this would be done through what's called an adaptive environmental management plan. Adaptive in as much as nobody's actually certain what some of the impacts are going to be, so it needs to be able to be changed and flexible as we move through the sort of construction and operation phases. And that might be in a two-directional change. It might be that we find actually we have far less impact once we start operating than was predicted, so we can relax some of the requirements of the regulators, or we actually find that we're having more of an impact, therefore the regulations become more stringent. A whole range of different measures that we were considering applying. Some of these carry on with our sort of fishery, our marine surveys. We do tagging and tracking work of fish in the marine and freshwater environment. So here in the middle of the middle picture here, in the palm of that person's hand, that's a fish tag. In the body cavity of a sea trout, which is on the top left, and then that can be tracked using receivers positioned at strategic points in the coastal environment, which is the larger black object. And then we can download that, interrogate the data, and you can work out what the fish movements are in the coastal environment. We're then looking at other sort of technologies. So we're using side scan sonar to see if we can use that to actually monitor sort of the population of the seawall, for example, when it's constructed. We're looking at use of Tidson underwater cameras. These provide, if you want to afterwards, I've got a little video clip showing just how good these are. And these will operate in a sonar camera, so they'll operate in highly turbid conditions or in complete darkness. And we're looking ahead to future lagoons as well about putting potentially arrays of receivers for the fish tracking purposes across the whole of the Bristol Channel. And some of this work is already, Swansea University are already doing some work in Swansea Bay, putting receivers out there and getting some invaluable data on the movements of fish such as shad, which I talked about earlier. We've then got other sort of monitoring and mitigation. I put this image in the top left. Again, it's a distant image. This actually circled in orange here. This is an eel passing in front of turbines in the Netherlands as the turbines are actually rotating. So this eel isn't being swept through and chopped up into 1,000 pieces. It's actually swimming in front of the turbines and swims against the current away from them. This is all captured on the video. Some other aspects of the monitoring that we'd look at, obviously the model relies, and the striker model relies on the conditions within the turbines. In order to test what those conditions are actually like, we're proposing to use what are called sensor fish, which are these little devices here, which are a bit like a test tube, a few inches long, which you can deploy, drop into the entrance to the turbines and then recover on the far side. They've got like a flotation unit, a balloon that self-inflates and brings them to the surface. You can then download the data and that will give you data on the pressure, the pitch and the yaw as they pass through to the turbulent conditions within the turbines themselves. And then next steps is looking basically at the what mitigation could occur as a result. So if we have this sort of are expected to mitigate against a 10% impact on salmon, what can we do as a company to offset those impacts? So one of the aspects we're looking at is saying, okay, are there any barriers to migration as part of their freshwater life cycle that is impacting on in-river populations? And as it happens in the Swansea Valley area, there are a number of these. And this is the Towie Barrage, which is the first barrage in the UK. So this is a tidal barrage in Swansea on the River Towie. This is the fish pass that you can see on the left-hand side, and this is the primary weir on the right-hand side. And this gets overtopped on the big tides, but not on all tides. So it does become a barrier to fish coming back into the river, and the fish pass is pretty inefficient as well. So that's one option, and I think probably the best option for us is to redesign, rebuild the fish pass on the Towie Barrage so that more returning adult fish can get back into the river. And as we look upstream as well, there are numerous historic weirs on the River Towie underneath the Avon, such as this one, which fish aren't going to be able to, salmon isn't going to be able to get over this even under flood conditions. So if we were able to put a fish pass on here, it would open up about a third of the Towie catchment, which brings that area back into production, which would more than compensate for the predicted loss of fish from the lagoon. And this just illustrates that barrier I just showed you is in this area here, and this is the whole catchment upstream of it. But there's all these little dots are basically man-made obstructions to migration on the River Towie. So you can see there are dozens and dozens of them that do need to be removed over time to get back to a sort of more natural situation. And so finally, what is the background that we'd used in previous talks, just to illustrate the sort of impact that we could sort of expect on salmon, was to put it into context. So, and admittedly, things have changed because the last few years and the advent of climate change is starting to take its toll on salmon population. So they are starting to die out very, very sadly at the moment. Well, that seems to be the case as climate change takes it, has its impact. But back in 2016, the white fish here, they depict salmon typically caught in the River Towie by, or the population of salmon in the River Towie. The grey were the proportion of fish that would have been lost due to angling in the river. And then there are predation losses at the barrage where the fish couldn't get over the barrage, so they're picked off by seals and eaten there. And then so the white, the grey and the yellow sort of depicts what the existing populations of returning salmon would be to the River Towie. The orange is what we believe to be the potential to expand on that population through the mitigation that we're proposing. And the bits in red would be the actual lagoon impacts as were predicted in some of the previous modelling. So that's probably actually slightly larger now, that area red, but nevertheless, it sort of shows the sort of the potential impact of the lagoon on the overall populations that we'd expect to find in the river. I'd say the difficulty is the population of spawning salmon, I think it was 260 fish in 2016. No, sorry, 362 fish in 2016. That down to about, it's far, far less than that now. So, so much so that the angling pressure has actually been removed on the river. So people aren't allowed to catch and kill salmon anymore. If they catch one, they have to put it back. The predation still exists though, and the potential for further improvements. So that was sort of Swansea, and if that went ahead, then that would be the Pathfinder project with a view to a whole series of lagoons potentially. The largest being the one in Cardiff. So comparisons of the two, Swansea Lagoon would generate, I think it's 320 megawatts of electricity at peak production, which would be enough electricity for 150,000 properties, so households. That's roughly all the houses would be able to be powered by the Swansea Lagoon, as opposed to Cardiff, when you really start to ramp up the impacts. So you're creating a bigger lagoon, which would cost probably 3 to 4 times as much. So you're going from about 1.5 billion for cost in Swansea to about 4.5 billion for Cardiff, but it would generate at least 8 times as much electricity as Swansea. So that would be enough electricity to power the whole of Wales, pretty much, and then start quite a significant impact on the UK's sort of renewable, overall energy generation. And these two combined with the other lagoons that the company at the time were proposing would provide around 6% of the UK's energy. Well, sorry, 6 to 8%, I think it was. 6 lagoons and 8% of the energy potential. Obviously, the materials from an engineering point of view required would scale up. So you can just see here the volumes that would be required. So you're almost sort of not quite doubling the amount of rock armour that would be required in Cardiff compared to Swansea. Certainly a lot more quarry runs. There's the inner wall and the infill that's required in the core of the lagoon wall. But I guess the key factor here is the volumes of water that would be retained within the lagoon. So the jug on the left refers to Swansea, whereas this would be the volume of Cardiff by comparison, which is why you get this sort of 8 times the energy generation in Cardiff than you would compared to the Swansea Lagoon. The project, when it was running, at its peak, the company employed about 76 people. I was actually, I don't know if it's an honour or not, but I was the last person to be made redundant in the company. It just shows how important fish are. But that was on New Year's Eve 2018, sadly. But prior to that, we had a huge program. We had PhD students that are being sponsored. We had CCAMS projects, which is an initiative run by Swansea University. They were running a whole range of European funded projects looking at monitoring that would benefit not just us, but any marine renewable energy installation. So it was looking at the migration routes of fish, for example, or turbine impacts, that sort of thing that would have wider benefits than just for one company. And where are we now? Well, back in 2015, the development consent order was granted for Swansea. At the same time, the developers applied for marine licence from Swansea, from the regulators. In our case, it was Natural Resources Wales. The development consent order was granted in 2015. The marine licence still hasn't been granted, and there are still negotiations going on around that. The development consent order is due to run out this summer. They expire after 5 years. And for those that aren't familiar, a development consent order is it's like a planning permission for major developments that isn't granted by the local authority, it's granted by the central government for major infrastructure projects. So a nuclear power station would get a development consent order, for example. So we were granted that, but because the marine licensing comes under different legislation, that was devolved to the Welsh Government and their regulatory body, Natural Resources Wales. And they were the ones that got concerns about various environmental aspects of the lagoon, and so haven't provided the marine license as yet. But the development settlement runs out this summer, so the developers behind it, even though the staff working on the project were made redundant, the previous director through another company, they're still trying to get that development order into place. So it still remains active, if you like. So in terms of timescales, if the marine license could be obtained from NRW, probably, and this is off the top of my head, probably 1 or 2 years to remobilize the company, to bring the engineers that they had back. I mean, they've distributed themselves all over the world now because they were experts in marine renewables. To bring them back, reform a team that could then crack on with the construction, which, as I said earlier, would probably take 4 or 5 years to complete. And one of the reasons we were building this is to create a renewable form of energy. And if we continue with some of the summers that we've had in the last few years, yes, there will be impacts of the lagoon on fish, but there'll be consequence with fish if we don't take further action, in my view. And obviously, fish can't live in dry rivers. So thank you very much. Hope that was of benefit and entertaining, useful. I'll try and switch from sharing mode now so I can actually see who's there. And if people have got any questions, I can always revert back.